name's Adam Piron. I am from the Kiowa and Mohawk tribes. I really wanted to look at a history of Indigenous American actors, specifically within American cinema, and some of the more unique roles that they played in terms of characters that weren't overtly Indigenous in the sense that, they weren't playing to what audiences would expect when seeing an Indigenous character or performer on screen. It was kind of something from some of my own questions and, even some of realizing some of my own ingrained expectations that I found within myself, even as an Indigenous person within the audience. I was interested in sort of, for myself, exploring where a lot of them come from and why. I think when you go back to the very early history of cinema as it was being developed, you get somebody like William Kennedy Dixon in 1894 who was working in Thomas Edison's Black Maria studios. And some of the works he was working on, really early on, showcased Lakota performers from Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. It really sort of sets the expectations where a lot of these early Indigenous performers were in Wild West shows where the expectation was that they were performing some aspects of their own cultures for, largely white audiences. It was a part of American entertainment at the time. Interesting to also think of, too, that, a lot of these performers were performing their own traumas that happened to them purely for entertainment. It's something that sits with me a lot in terms of when I watch a lot of these early films and a lot of these performers. But it's really because of Wild West shows that indigeneity, to a certain extent within American film, starts to become a costume and an expectation to an extent. This where you get the buckskin, the headdresses, and the teepees. Because a lot of these performers were Lakota and Cheyenne. And they just sort of brought what they had with them, and that just became some of the early images that people came to associate with Indigenous people within the U.S.
Yeah. Court's called to order.
There's an outlier, Will Rogers, who was a Cherokee performer, also from Wild West shows, but he was a bit of an anomaly at the time because he was very openly Cherokee, but he was also a cowboy. He became an image of what a cowboy should be. But also, I think within, specifically white audiences, people saw him as a cowboy and not necessarily as an Indigenous person, which him being a cowboy was not at odds with sort of the ranching culture of his tribe at the time. He went on to work with people like Hal Roach, and his favorite director to work with was actually John Ford. He made 3 films with him, and he actually became the highest paid actor in Hollywood in the 1930s. He was racking in $500,000 a year until his death in 1935. And he's notable in the sense that he got top billing on all of his films. He was like the draw for people to go see that film. And, he had a large degree of creative autonomy. And this is something that also has not been replicated in roughly a century since for Native American actors specifically. A little bit later, there's another boom in Westerns, and that slides back to Indigenous people, being perceived as sort of the villains or cannon fodder, or just sort of in the background as well. And that really continues, for the most part, really up until 1990, where the Western as a genre is sort of revived with Dances with Wolves. The film's notable for sure in terms of showcasing First Nations actors from Canada, in particular Graham Greene and Tonto Cardinal. But, from the US side, it's really Wes Studi who plays a Pawnee warrior that really sort of stands out. I think Studi's an interesting performer in the sense too that that was a very early role for him, but he's also able to transition that into bigger films. It's in 1992 where Studi stars as Magua in Michael Mann's The Last of the Mohicans. He really sort of cements himself as the quote-unquote image within Hollywood of the fierce Native American warrior in film. And then he collaborates again with Mann and Heat in 1995. When you see his character of Casals, it's another really interesting transition because there's this peak also that's happening in 90s films of sort of these larger action films that are becoming top box office draws. And then in Heat in particular, when you see Studi, he really stands out. You just see him there, because I think you're so used to seeing him as this warrior figure, and I think him as just a cop with Pacino and and the rest of the LAPD, it's a really great subversion in the sense that, again, too, there's this expectation that Studi was already kind of building within his own career, but seeing him within this context is something that's really unprecedented. He's not expected to talk about his own indigeneity. He's not expected to talk about whatever reservation he comes from. He's just a part of the LAPD, and he's really great with a shotgun, and he's just, again, part of the force that's driving the film forward. It's a really awesome kind of moment of just seeing somebody within the context of this a modern kind of story about the LAPD, and they just get to be a part of the action. With Shannyn Sossamon in her first role in A Knight's Tale, I think it really sort of opens up the questions and sort of like some of the latitude that brings Indigenous actors with being able to play, again, sort of these roles like Studi to an extent, where they're just able to play characters and not sort of contextualize themselves or why they're there.
Better a silly girl with a flower than a silly boy with a horse and a stick.
Her character, she's just there in a completely different time period, a completely different continent, and within the context of a totally different mythology that's outside of Hawaii. And I think that there's something that's really powerful about that. This is also something that's pre-Bridgerton in the way that it's playing, in particular with her, seeing her as an Indigenous performer within a period piece, set in England at the time. There's a lot of power to that, where it again too, it sort of breaks beyond the expectation of when you would see an Indigenous Hawaiian performer in a role, and what are some of the colonial expectations of that, where this subverts any sort of expectations that are built in when you'd see an Indigenous performer on screen.
Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein. I would have him win my heart.
David Strathairn's another case of that as well, another Native Hawaiian performer. I think to an extent he's almost kind of like a Native Hawaiian Will Rogers, in the sense that he has such a breadth of his filmography, and he's never necessarily played an overtly Hawaiian character. But when you look at his work, start in the 1980s, specifically with a lot of his work with John Sayles, he's just approached as an actor. He's just playing characters, and they're just seen as human beings with depth and desire and disappointments and their own personal triumphs. And there's something that's really, again, sort of subversive about that, and it shatters a lot of the expectations of why would we expect an Indigenous actor to play a certain type of role. Why can't they just be anybody from within the world of baseball in 8 Men Out, or sort of his role in My Blueberry Nights, where he's just playing a cop who's dealing with his own personal heartbreak. I think there's a lot of power to his work and what it's opened up. And then you get to Lily Gladstone in Certain Women. The film itself is great, but I think also there's something about that character that's so interesting, because they can be coded in so many different ways. They could be coded as ethnically ambiguous, they could be coded as Native, or they could be even coded as white to some extent. And I think, it really doesn't matter to an extent, because that character is so rooted in Lily Gladstone's performance and that character's own experience and in internal emotional turmoil, that it's just refreshing to see an Indigenous performer just being a person, somebody who's, again, just sort of moving through their own world in their own way. And all that's really at stake is their own emotional stakes and how their world is defined by themselves or their feelings for other characters. I think all of these performers, when you look at it, to an extent, I think that they're divorced from this notion or this expectation of, like, when we see Indigenous performers, of them having to perform or explain their own indigeneity in terms of performing these different characters or embodying these characters. Through their work in particular, they've been able to test a lot of our own expectations of what we see. All of these performers open the door to giving Indigenous American performers the room to go beyond the original kind of colonial frameworks of cinema's first century, and how so much of that has built how we see Indigenous people. It's not just about seeing what we know they all can do as actors, but also what any Indigenous American actor is capable of. And as living, breathing, multidimensional people who just live lives like everyone else, they're definitely a door to what can be, and I think what should be as well too.